Rosa Elena Martinez had learned to move through San Miguel like a shadow, present but unnoticed, fulfilling her role as the orphan girl who lived in the church's charity quarters and earned her keep by baking bread for sale to the townspeople. At 16, she had spent 4 years in this existence since her parents died in a flash flood, leaving her with no family and no prospects beyond the modest mercy offered by Father Domingo, who allowed her to sleep in a storage room and use the church kitchen in exchange for her labor. The arrangement kept her alive but offered nothing resembling hope or future, and Rosa had long since accepted that her life would be defined by this marginal existence, until she either married someone equally poor or simply faded away into the kind of poverty that killed slowly and without dignity. The summer heat on that particular day was brutal even by New Mexico standards, the kind that made every breath feel like inhaling fire, and that drove most sensible people to seek shade and stillness. Rosa was carrying her basket of bread toward the town square, hoping to sell enough loaves to cover the cost of flour and perhaps have a few coins left for herself, when she saw the crowd gathered around something that had drawn their morbid attention. As she approached, she realized they were watching a captive Navajo warrior who had been chained to the wooden post in the center of the square. Punishment and display combined in the casual cruelty that frontier justice often practiced. The warrior looked to be in his early 30s, his traditional clothing torn and filthy, his face showing evidence of beatings, and his body slumped in a way that suggested exhaustion and dehydration were overwhelming whatever pride or defiance he might have possessed when first captured. A hand-lettered sign hung around his neck, declaring him a thief and a threat to civilized settlement, though Rosa had heard whispers that his actual crime was refusing to relocate to reservation lands and continuing to live according to traditional ways that white authorities found inconvenient. The townspeople watching him showed no sympathy. They treated his suffering as entertainment or as justified punishment, occasionally throwing insults or small stones while he remained unable to defend himself or escape. Rosa felt her stomach turn at the casual cruelty on display, but she knew better than to voice objections. Speaking up for a Navajo prisoner would accomplish nothing except drawing negative attention to herself, and she could not afford to lose what little security her position at the church provided. She tried to continue past the square toward her usual selling locations, but something stopped her. Perhaps the warrior's resemblance to her own father, who had also been dark-skinned and had also suffered the contempt of those who viewed mixed heritage people as less than fully human. Or perhaps it was simply that she recognized in his suffering a mirror of her own powerlessness and marginalization, and she could not walk away from someone whose pain so clearly reflected her own existence. Before she fully decided what she was doing, Rosa found herself approaching the chained warrior. Her basket of bread clutched protectively against her chest. Several townspeople called out warnings that he was dangerous, that approaching him was foolish, that she was risking herself for a savage who would show her no gratitude. Rosa ignored them, her heart pounding but her steps steady, and stopped in front of the warrior close enough to speak to him directly. His eyes opened when he sensed her presence, and she saw in them not the menace the townspeople claimed, but rather resignation and pain that seemed to extend beyond his physical suffering to something deeper and more profound. Rosa spoke quietly in Spanish, asking if he understood her language. The warrior nodded slightly and she continued, "I have bread and water. I'll share if you want." The offer was simple, almost absurdly inadequate given his circumstances, but the warrior's expression shifted to something like surprise, or perhaps disbelief, that anyone would show him kindness. He nodded again, more firmly, and Rosa carefully broke a piece from one of her loaves and held it where he could reach with his chained hands. He ate slowly, as if the simple act of consuming food required enormous effort, then drank from the water skin she offered with obvious desperate thirst. As Rosa helped him, several townspeople began voicing stronger objections. A merchant named Cordero, who considered himself an authority on proper behavior and morality, approached and told Rosa sternly that she was making a mistake, that the prisoner didn't deserve charity, that her bleeding heart was typical of foolish young women who didn't understand the realities of frontier survival. Rosa responded with more courage than she felt that Jesus had commanded, feeding the hungry and giving water to the thirsty without requiring them to earn such mercy, and that she was simply following her faith's teachings. Cordero sputtered about context and appropriate application of scripture, but Rosa had already turned back to the warrior, offering him more bread while trying to ignore the hostile murmurs spreading through the watching crowd. The warrior spoke for the first time, his Spanish accented but clear. "Why you help me? You know what they say I am." Rosa answered honestly that she didn't know what he had or hadn't done, but that leaving someone to suffer in the sun without food or water, when she could easily provide both, seemed wrong, regardless of any crimes he might have committed. The warrior studied her face for a long moment, then said something that struck Rosa as strange at the time, but that would gain significance later. "You have good heart." That matters more than people think. Sometimes kindness makes louder sound than anything else. Before Rosa could ask what he meant, the town's deputy marshal arrived and roughly ordered her to move away from the prisoner. The deputy's tone carried threat barely concealed beneath official authority, and Rosa recognized she had pushed as far as she safely could. She gathered her basket and withdrew, but not before the warrior caught her eye one last time and spoke a single word in his own language, something that sounded like thanks or blessing, though Rosa couldn't be certain of its exact meaning. She continued toward her selling route, acutely aware of the hostile stares following her and of the whispered conversations her actions had triggered. The rest of Rosa's day proceeded normally. She sold most of her bread, returned to the church to prepare dough for the next day's baking, and completed her evening chores under Father Domingo's distant supervision. The priest mentioned in passing that he had heard about her encounter with the Navajo prisoner and advised her to avoid such incidents in the future, as they created unnecessary complications and reflected poorly on the church's reputation. Rosa accepted the mild rebuke without argument, recognizing that Father Domingo was more concerned with institutional standing than with theological consistency regarding mercy and compassion. As night fell and Rosa prepared for sleep in her small storage room, she heard the town settling into its usual evening quiet, the sounds of families finishing dinners, dogs barking, occasional laughter or arguments drifting from the saloon at the edge of town. She lay on her thin mattress thinking about the captive warrior, about his strange comment regarding kindness making loud sounds, and about the hostile reactions her simple act had generated. She felt troubled and uncertain, wondering if she had been foolish to risk the little security she possessed for a stranger who would be transported away in the morning and whom she would never see again. Then, around midnight, the church bell began to ring, not the measured tolling that marked the hours or called people to services, but rather a continuous frantic clanging that shattered the night's peace and sent a jolt of alarm through Rosa's chest. She scrambled from her mattress and rushed toward the church proper, where she found Father Domingo already investigating the source of the impossible noise. The bell was ringing with violent intensity, despite no one pulling the rope. No wind to move it, no explicable cause for its behavior. The priest's face showed fear mixing with confusion as he tried unsuccessfully to stop the bell's motion, and Rosa felt ice forming in her stomach as she realized that something beyond normal explanation was occurring, and that somehow she suspected it was connected to the kindness she had shown to a captive warrior just hours before. The church bell continued its manic ringing through the night, the sound carrying across San Miguel and waking every resident within miles. By the time dawn broke, a crowd had gathered at the church, some genuinely concerned, others excited by the supernatural drama unfolding, and still others clearly frightened by a phenomenon that defied rational explanation. Father Domingo had tried everything to silence the bell, cutting the rope, attempting to physically stop its motion, even having several strong men try to hold the bell itself motionless, but nothing worked. The moment any restraint was released, the bell resumed its violent clanging, as if propelled by invisible and inexhaustible force. Rosa stood at the edge of the gathering crowd, her heart sinking as she heard the whispered conversations spreading through the townspeople. Many were claiming the bell's behavior was a sign from God, though they disagreed about what the sign meant. Some insisted it was divine judgment on the town's sins. Others suggested it was warning of some approaching catastrophe, and still others connected it directly to the presence of the Navajo warrior in the town square. This last interpretation gained momentum when several people remembered seeing Rosa give food and water to the prisoner just hours before the bell began its impossible ringing. Señora Gutierrez, an elderly woman known for her strong opinions and her influence among the town's more superstitious residents, was the first to voice the accusation directly. That girl consorted with the savage, and now his witchcraft has cursed our church. Everyone knows the natives practice dark magic. She's brought evil upon us all. The claim was absurd and offensive, but Rosa saw it taking hold among people who wanted simple explanations for frightening phenomena, who preferred to blame outsiders rather than examine their own failings, and who had never liked her anyway, because of her mixed heritage and her marginal status. Father Domingo tried to calm the growing panic, insisting that the church did not recognize native witchcraft as having real power, and that there must be some natural explanation for the bell's behavior that would be discovered with proper investigation. But his rational appeals had little effect on a crowd that was rapidly working itself into hysteria. Rosa found herself being pointed at, whispered about, and increasingly isolated as people literally moved away from her as if her presence carried contagion. She wanted to defend herself, to argue that giving bread and water to a hungry prisoner could not possibly cause supernatural phenomena, but she recognized that logic would accomplish nothing with people who had already decided she was responsible for whatever was happening. The situation escalated when Cordero, the merchant who had criticized Rosa's kindness the previous day, demanded that she be questioned formally about what exactly she had done when approaching the prisoner. Had she spoken to him beyond offering food? Had he said anything strange or performed any gestures that might have been incantations? Cordero's interrogation was aggressive and clearly designed to establish Rosa's guilt rather than to discover truth, and she found herself struggling to respond to questions that assumed her complicity in some imagined curse. She told them honestly that she had simply given the warrior bread and water, that their conversation had been brief and unremarkable, and that she had done nothing that could explain a church bell ringing without cause. As this confrontation continued, someone arrived from the town square with startling news. The Navajo warrior had vanished from his chains during the night. The post where he had been secured stood empty, the chains unlocked but showing no signs of forced breaking, and no one had seen or heard anything despite guards being posted nearby. The timing of his disappearance coinciding with the bell's impossible ringing immediately reinforced the supernatural interpretation, and Cordero seized on this development to intensify his accusations against Rosa. He insisted she must have been part of a plan to free the prisoner using native magic, that her act of charity had actually been a signal or a ritual that enabled his escape, and that had somehow animated the bell as cover for the deed. Rosa felt panic rising as the accusations grew more elaborate and more dangerous. She was just a 16-year-old orphan, with no power, no magic, and no connection to any escape plan. She had simply given food to a suffering prisoner out of basic human compassion. But she also recognized that her truth was less compelling than the supernatural narrative the townspeople were constructing, because her truth required them to acknowledge that their own cruelty toward the prisoner had been wrong, and that perhaps the bell was ringing as divine condemnation of their behavior rather than as evidence of witchcraft. Accepting her explanation would require moral self-examination that most of the crowd clearly wanted to avoid. Father Domingo intervened before the situation could escalate to physical violence, taking Rosa into the church building and away from the hostile crowd. He told her seriously that she needed to think very carefully about what had actually happened, that if there were details she was withholding, perhaps from fear or confusion, now was the time to share them. Rosa insisted again that she had done nothing except offer food and water, but she could see the priest's faith in her explanation wavering. He wanted to believe her, but the bells continued ringing, and the prisoner's inexplicable escape were undermining his confidence in rational explanations and making the supernatural interpretation seem increasingly plausible despite his theological training. Over the next several hours, as the bell continued its relentless clanging, and as town leaders debated what to do about both the phenomenon and about Rosa's alleged involvement, she sat alone in the church, trying to understand what was actually happening. She replayed her encounter with the warrior, searching for anything that might explain the current situation. His words came back to her. That kindness made louder sounds than people thought. At the time she had interpreted this as metaphorical. But what if he had meant something more literal? What if somehow her act of compassion had triggered something that was now manifesting through the bell? Rosa didn't believe in native witchcraft or in curses, but she also couldn't explain what was happening through any normal understanding of cause and effect. The bell should not be ringing on its own. The warrior should not have been able to escape his chains without tools or assistance. Something beyond normal explanation was clearly occurring, and she was somehow central to it, even though she had done nothing except follow her conscience and her faith's teachings about mercy. She felt trapped between the supernatural interpretation that cast her as villain and the rational explanation that no one wanted to accept, because it would require acknowledging that perhaps God or the universe or whatever forces governed existence were condemning the town's cruelty rather than Rosa's compassion. As evening approached, and the bell showed no signs of stopping, it had now been ringing continuously for nearly 24 hours. The town's leaders convened in the church to decide on a course of action. Rosa was brought before this impromptu tribunal and questioned again about her actions and her possible involvement in the warrior's escape. The mayor, a practical man named Vasquez who generally tried to govern fairly, seemed genuinely uncertain what to believe. He acknowledged that Rosa's explanation was simple and consistent, but he also couldn't ignore the extraordinary circumstances that had followed her interaction with the prisoner. Vasquez asked Rosa directly, "Do you swear before God that you practice no witchcraft, spoke no incantations, made no agreements with the Navajo to help him escape?" Rosa swore solemnly that she had done none of these things, that her only sin, if it could be called that, was showing mercy to someone suffering. Vasquez seemed inclined to believe her, but Cordero and several others continued insisting that her guilt was obvious, that the supernatural phenomena proved she had trafficked with evil forces, and that she should be punished or expelled from the town to end the curse she had brought upon them. The debate was interrupted by a new development that would transform the entire situation. A young boy burst into the church, breathless and frightened, reporting that he had discovered something in the bell tower that everyone needed to see immediately. The group rushed to investigate, and what they found in the tower stunned everyone into momentary silence. Carved into the wooden beam beside the bell mechanism was a message in careful Spanish that read, "This bell rings for justice denied, for mercy punished, for cruelty disguised as law. It will ring until truth is spoken and wrongs are acknowledged. The girl is innocent. The town is guilty." The discovery of the carved message in the bell tower created immediate chaos as people struggled to understand what it meant and how it could have appeared without anyone noticing. The carving was fresh. Wood shavings still lay scattered on the floor beneath it, yet no one had been in the tower since the bell began its impossible ringing. The implications were troubling regardless of how one interpreted them. Either supernatural forces had created the message, or someone had accessed the tower during the night without being seen and had carved an accusation that struck at the heart of the town's treatment of the Navajo. "Prisoner." Father Domingo examined the carving carefully, his theological training wrestling with phenomena that challenged his understanding of how the world worked. He addressed the assembled crowd, speaking with more authority than Rosa had heard from him before. Whether this message comes from divine intervention or human hand, its content deserves our attention. It speaks of justice denied and mercy punished, claims that should cause us to examine our consciences rather than simply searching for someone to blame for circumstances we find uncomfortable. The priest's words created space for reflection that had been absent during the previous day's hysteria. Several townspeople who had been caught up in the supernatural panic began reconsidering their accusations against Rosa. An elderly rancher named Ortega spoke up, admitting that he had been troubled by how the Navajo warrior had been treated, that denying a prisoner water in brutal heat seemed cruel regardless of what crimes he had committed, and that perhaps the bell was indeed calling them to account for behavior they had been too quick to justify. But not everyone was ready to accept this interpretation. Cordero insisted the message was obviously part of the native witchcraft, designed to confuse them and deflect blame from those who had consorted with evil. He argued that Rosa must have somehow enabled its creation, that accepting the message as legitimate was falling for exactly the kind of deception that made native magic so dangerous. His continued accusations found support among those who preferred supernatural villainy to moral self-examination, and the crowd remained divided between those willing to consider the message's challenge and those determined to maintain their original explanations. The debate was interrupted again by the arrival of a Navajo elder named Hastin Tso, who had traveled from the reservation after hearing about the supernatural events in San Miguel. His presence immediately heightened tensions. Some townspeople viewed him with suspicion or fear. Others were simply uncertain how to respond to a native man arriving uninvited during an already confusing situation. But Hastin Tso's bearing commanded respect, and when he asked permission to speak, Mayor Vasquez granted it despite Cordero's vocal objections. Hastin Tso addressed the crowd through a translator, explaining that he had known the captured warrior and could provide context about why he had been in San Miguel. The warrior, whose name was Hastin Yazi, had been traveling to visit a sick relative when he was arrested on fabricated charges by a deputy marshal who had a reputation for capturing natives to collect bounty payments. Hastin had committed no crimes and had offered no resistance, but he had been beaten, chained, and denied basic humanity simply because his presence was viewed as inconvenient or threatening by authorities who preferred all natives to remain on reservations regardless of legitimate reasons for travel. The elder continued, speaking directly about the bells ringing. I do not claim to know if spirits make your bell ring or if some other force is at work, but I know this. When people witness injustice and remain silent, when they see suffering and offer no help, when they punish mercy and reward cruelty, such behavior creates debts that must eventually be paid. Your bell rings because this girl, he gestured toward Rosa, showed the courage to do what your consciences should have demanded from all of you. She gave food and water to a suffering human being. If that action has produced supernatural response, perhaps you should ask not why did the bell start ringing, but rather, why did it take a poor orphan girl to do what the rest of you failed to do? Hastin Tso's words landed with the force of undeniable truth, and Rosa saw several townspeople's expressions shift to shame or discomfort as they confronted implications they had been avoiding. The elder wasn't claiming supernatural explanations or defending witchcraft. He was simply pointing out moral failures that were unambiguous regardless of one's beliefs about bells or magic. Rosa had acted with compassion, while the rest of the town had acted with cruelty or indifference, and whatever was happening with the bell seemed to be highlighting that fundamental contrast. Mayor Vasquez spoke, his voice carrying the weight of someone making a difficult decision. Hastin Tso is right. Regardless of how we explain the bell's behavior, we cannot escape the fact that we treated a prisoner with unnecessary cruelty, and that the only person who showed him basic mercy was a young girl whom we then accused of witchcraft for doing what our faith explicitly commands. This is not the community we claim to be, and perhaps the bell rings to force us to acknowledge that truth. The mayor's statement opened a floodgate of confession and reflection. Several townspeople spoke up, admitting they had been troubled by Hastin Yazi's treatment, but had remained silent out of fear or social pressure. Others acknowledged that their accusations against Rosa had been driven more by desire to avoid self-examination than by any real evidence of wrongdoing. Still others, including Father Domingo, confessed that they had failed in their moral and spiritual leadership by not challenging the cruelty displayed in the town square. Cordero and his supporters continued to resist, insisting that this was all manipulation and that accepting guilt for simply following normal procedures regarding native prisoners was foolish sentimentalism. But their voices were increasingly isolated as the majority of townspeople moved toward recognition that something had indeed been wrong with how they had behaved, and that whether the bell's ringing was supernatural or not, its message deserved to be heard rather than dismissed. As these conversations continued through the evening, something remarkable happened. The bell's ringing began to slow. The frantic clanging that had continued without pause for 2 days gradually diminished to a steadier, more measured tolling, then eventually to complete silence. The sudden quiet was almost shocking after hours of constant noise, and everyone stood still. Listening to the absence of sound that had become so overwhelming, they had almost forgotten what silence felt like. Father Domingo spoke into the quiet. "Perhaps the bell has achieved its purpose. We have acknowledged our failures, we have heard the truth we needed to hear, and we have begun the process of examining our consciences and our behavior. Whether divine intervention or some other force caused the bell to ring, it seems that speaking truth and acknowledging wrong has ended its need to continue." The crowd dispersed slowly, people returning to their homes in a state of reflection that was markedly different from the panic and accusation that had dominated the previous days. Rosa remained in the church, emotionally exhausted, but also relieved that she was no longer under suspicion. Father Domingo approached her and apologized sincerely for doubting her, for not defending her more forcefully from accusations, and for not recognizing sooner that her actions had been exemplary, while the town's behavior had been shameful. The priest continued, "Speaking about changes that needed to happen, you showed us what our faith actually requires when it's practiced rather than merely preached. I have been too comfortable, too willing to accept cruelty as long as it was directed at others, and didn't threaten the church's standing. You, with nothing but conscience to guide you, did better than I have done with all my training and authority. That is a humbling lesson I needed to learn." Rosa accepted his apology, but also asked the question that still troubled her. "Father, do you believe it was truly supernatural? Do you think spirits or God made the bell ring?" Father Domingo considered carefully before responding. "I don't know. I can explain neither how the bell rang without human intervention, nor how the message appeared in the tower. But I know this. Whether the cause was divine, supernatural, or some elaborate human action we haven't discovered, the result has been to force us to confront truth we were avoiding. And perhaps that's what matters most. Not the mechanism by which we were confronted, but our response to the confrontation itself." In the weeks following the bell's mysterious ringing, San Miguel underwent changes that would have seemed impossible before the crisis forced collective self-examination. The town council formally apologized for Hastinyazi's treatment and invited Hasti and So to establish regular communication between the town and the Navajo reservation, creating channels for resolving conflicts and misunderstandings before they escalated to violence or injustice. Mayor Vasquez implemented new policies requiring that all prisoners receive adequate food, water and medical attention regardless of their alleged crimes or their ethnicity. And he removed the deputy marshal, whose bounty hunting practices had led to Hastinyazi's unjust capture. Father Domingo, chastened by his failure to provide moral leadership during the crisis, became more active in advocating for fair treatment of marginalized people, using his sermons to challenge prejudices and comfortable cruelties that his congregation had been practicing without examination. He also elevated Rosa's status within the church community, formally recognizing her as someone whose faith and courage had taught him and the congregation important lessons about the gap between professed beliefs and actual behavior. Rosa herself experienced significant transformation in how the town viewed and treated her. She was no longer just the invisible orphan girl who baked bread in the church kitchen. She had become a symbol of conscience acted upon despite cost, of compassion offered without calculation, and of the moral courage that sometimes resided in unlikely people whom society had dismissed as irrelevant. Several townspeople offered her better work opportunities. A wealthy widow provided her with proper living quarters, rather than the storage room she had been occupying, and generally the community began treating her with respect and appreciation that had been entirely absent from her previous marginalized existence. But not all changes were positive or comfortable. The mystery of what had actually caused the bell to ring was never definitively solved. No mechanism was discovered, no human conspirator was identified, and the carved message in the tower remained as inexplicable as the bell's behavior had been. Some townspeople remained convinced it had been supernatural intervention, either divine or demonic, depending on their interpretations. Others believed it must have been an elaborate hoax, though they could not explain who would have had motive or means to execute such deception. Still others simply accepted the mystery as unsolvable and focused on the results rather than continuing to debate causes. Rosa found herself sought out by people wanting to understand what she had experienced, what she knew about the bell, whether she had any special insights into what had happened. She consistently told them the simple truth, that she had given bread and water to a suffering prisoner because doing so seemed right, that she had no knowledge of why the bell began ringing, or how the message appeared in the tower, and that she was as confused as anyone about the supernatural aspects of the situation. Some people were disappointed by this lack of dramatic revelation, but others appreciated her honesty and her refusal to claim special status or understanding she didn't actually possess. About 2 months after the events, Rosa received an unexpected visit from Hastin Yazi, the warrior she had helped, who had escaped his chains during the night the bell rang and who had been presumed to have fled far from San Miguel to avoid recapture. He arrived openly during daylight, accompanied by Hastin Tso, and sought Rosa out to express gratitude he had been unable to voice while chained in the town square. Through the elder's translation, Hastin explained that Rosa's small act of kindness had meant more to him than she could know, that it had been the only mercy shown during his capture and imprisonment, and that it had restored his faith that goodness still existed even in places where cruelty seemed to dominate. Rosa asked Hastin directly if he knew anything about the bell or the message, if there was some explanation he could provide for what had happened that night. Hastin smiled and spoke words that the elder translated carefully. "I cannot tell you how the bell rang or how the message appeared, because I do not know. But I can tell you this. Sometimes the universe speaks loudly when human voices are too quiet. You spoke through action when others remained silent, and somehow that created sound that could not be ignored. Whether spirits helped or whether there is explanation in normal world, the important thing is that truth was finally heard." Hastin's non-answer was frustrating but also somehow satisfying. Rosa realized she might never know exactly what had happened that night, might never be able to explain the mechanics of bells ringing without human cause or messages appearing without human hand. But she also recognized that Hastin was right. The mechanism mattered less than the result. And the result had been that truth was spoken, wrong was acknowledged, and a community was forced to confront behavior it had been rationalizing. As months and then years passed, the story of the orphan girl and the ringing bell became legend in San Miguel and beyond. The tale was told and retold with various embellishments and interpretations, some emphasizing the supernatural elements and others focusing on the moral lessons. Rosa herself became a respected member of the community, eventually marrying a schoolteacher who valued her intelligence and her character, and raising children who learned from her example about courage, compassion, and the importance of acting according to conscience, even when doing so brought risk or opposition. Father Domingo lived many more years, and in his final sermon before retiring, he spoke about the bell incident as the defining moment of his ministry, the time when he was forced to recognize that his own comfort and institutional concerns had made him complicit in injustice, and when a poor orphan girl had taught him what his faith actually demanded when it was lived rather than merely professed. He told the congregation that he had spent years studying theology and scripture, but that Rosa had understood something more fundamental through simple conscience, that feeding the hungry and giving water to the thirsty admitted no exceptions, no qualifications, no calculations about whether the suffering person was worthy or convenient to help. The bell tower itself became something of a pilgrimage site, with people occasionally visiting to see the carved message that had appeared so mysteriously and that had never faded or been removed. The words remained clearly legible. "This bell rings for justice denied, for mercy punished, for cruelty disguised as law. It will ring until truth is spoken and wrongs are acknowledged. The girl is innocent. The town is guilty," serving as permanent reminder of a night when the impossible had happened and when a community had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths it had been avoiding. Rosa, when asked in her later years about that extraordinary night and about the bell that wouldn't stop ringing, always returned to the simplest truth. "I gave bread and water to someone who was hungry and thirsty. Everything else, the bell, the message, the changes that followed, those are mysteries I cannot explain. But I know this: kindness matters, mercy is never wasted, and sometimes the smallest acts have consequences far beyond what we can see or predict. I don't know if God made that bell ring or spirits, or some human hand we never discovered. But I know that speaking truth and acting with compassion are never wrong, even when they bring complications or costs we didn't anticipate. The orphan girl who sold bread to a captive warrior had indeed triggered consequences that night when the church bell wouldn't stop ringing. But those consequences, however mysterious their mechanism, had ultimately served justice rather than undermining it, had forced acknowledgement of wrong rather than allowing comfortable cruelty to continue unchallenged, and had demonstrated that sometimes the universe, through whatever means, ensured that silence was broken and that conscience could not be permanently ignored. Rosa's simple act of mercy had echoed far beyond what she could have imagined, and the bell's impossible ringing had amplified that echo until even the most resistant hearts had to finally hear what they had been refusing to acknowledge: that their behavior had been wrong, that Rosa had been right, and that truth would ultimately be heard even when human voices tried to suppress or silence it.